Welcome to our first session of day 2 of our international conference presented by the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Last night we crossed the line of departure. The campaign today continues. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Black's lecture yesterday evening, but we have another great day of programming on our campaign. In this session, we're tackling a huge topic: Admiral Chester Nimitz, his commanders and leadership in the Pacific Theater of Operations. And fortunately for that, we have some excellent historians to tackle that. No pressure. Our good friend John Parshall will chair the panel, offer questions to Dr. Craig Symonds, Trent Hone, both of which are renowned military naval historians here today to talk about Chester Nimitz and his role in the Pacific Theater of Operations. John's a co-author of the definitive book on Midway, Shattered Sword, and the preeminent historian in the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II in the Western world. And John has been a frequent past presenter, has been an invaluable part of our educational travel programs in the Pacific, and we know he will perform yeoman service today. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I just discovered that I have lost my notes, so that'll keep my remarks even briefer, which is good for everybody. So.
Actually, I stole them, but I'm not going to tell him that.
So good morning, everyone. To my immediate left, I have Dr. Craig Symonds, who was a professor at the Naval Academy for 34 years, served there also as the chairman of the department for 4 years. Also has taught in Great Britain at one of the naval academies there, was also the Ernest J. King Chair of Strategy at the Naval War College in
Newport.
Thank you.
See, he needs his notes.
Yes. He's the author of 16 books, the most recent of which is on Chester Nimitz, and we're going to be discussing that this morning. At the far end of the table, we have Trent Hone, who is a vice president at ICF International, where he is a frequent lecturer on various technology strategy subjects and is very interested in how organizations adapt. That's sort of the subject of his professional life. Meanwhile, his hobby, and I know this gig because I was a full-time IT guy up until 2 years ago and when history became my gig, but his side gig is writing very well-received books. His book, Learning War, came out in 2018 and has been widely regarded as very innovative in the field, won the Naval Institute's prize that year, I believe. And his most recent book, likewise, is on Nimitz. Both of these books came out in 2022, so we're going to be discussing that. Obviously, we're here today to talk about Chester Nimitz, who, in my opinion, is the finest naval officer that this country has ever produced. He rode herd over the largest trifibious war in history and was successful in prosecuting it. He is absolutely the man behind the seminal victory at Midway. And as the war evolves and becomes bigger and bigger, he demonstrates a tremendous ability to adapt to that war and to instill in his staff the sort of personal virtues that he brought to his own command, namely a tremendous intelligence, an ability to remain calm under pressure, a genuinely convivial personality that helped motivate his staff and keep them focused on the battle, and an understated yet ferocious aggressiveness to come to grips with the Japanese and destroy them. Along the way, he had to manage some very difficult personalities, perhaps the most difficult being his boss, Ernest J. King, who was probably the harshest taskmaster in the entire U.S. military, and yet he manages to forge a very productive working relationship with him. So we're here to discuss Nimitz in his entirety. And with that, I want to ask you, Craig, just right off the bat, why a new book on Nimitz? Why now?
Oh, what a great question. And it allows me to tell this story, and that is about 4 years ago, both Trent and I were at a conference in San Diego. And you know how you do when you're at a conference. What are you working on? What are you thinking about doing next? And we looked at each other and we both said, Nimitz. Uh-oh. This is going to be a problem.
Yeah,
but then we discussed it, right?
Yes, we did.
And,
after my blood ran cold.
Yeah, well. And we appreciated that the approach each of it was taking was slightly different from the other. Now, there'd been a previous biography of Nimitz, and it's a full life biography, which our books are not really that, by Elmer B. Potter, Ned Potter, as he was known, my former colleague at the Academy, who wrote that book in the 1970s, came out in 1976. But it's a life history from birth to death. And what we did, I think, and I'll let Trent speak for himself, what I wanted to do was try to plumb how Nimitz managed to pull this off, how he did, in fact, work with a difficult boss, an extraordinarily difficult partner, if you would, in the Southwest Pacific, a fellow named Douglas MacArthur, and subordinates with nicknames like Howling Mad, Terrible Turner, and Bull, and yet managed to coordinate all of these and get everybody pulling in the same direction simultaneously to get this job done. Who was that guy? That was what I was trying to get at.
Yeah. So I did not know this. You actually, both of you knew that you...
We knew.
We knew.
You knew. And there were no, like, knives out or anything like that?
No. Craig was extremely gracious, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And we very quickly, as he said, sort of worked out how we have different perspectives and different angles on this question of Nimitz as a leader in the Pacific and how we wanted to approach that. The angle that I wanted to take was to extend the analysis that I'd done in Learning War, thank you for mentioning it, John, where I looked at innovation in tactics and doctrine within the United States Navy in the early 20th century up through the end of World War II. And the reviews of that were positive, but they noted that, the hero of the story is the organization, the Navy as a system, not many individuals. I touch on them, but I don't spend a lot of time on them. So one of the things that I wanted to do was look at, well, what influence can an individual in a position of authority, a position of leadership have on the evolution of tactics, doctrine, strategy, and the like? How can they shape that? And Nimitz seemed a perfect vehicle for it, particularly when looking at the Pacific theater in World War II. And so that's the path that I started to go down, looking at it more from Nimitz's influence on staff, on organization, on how plans and orders are framed, touching on personality aspects like Craig does, but more from an organizational standpoint. And I think the books complement each other quite well. I think we've succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well done. Well done. Well, and actually, that's sort of an aspect of Pacific War history that I've found interesting over the years, is that I really do feel that in this field, it is a very collaborative group of individuals, and by and large, folks are very supportive of each other's efforts. So, and now I don't have the benefit of the questions I had written out here, so that's all good. Now I'm going by memory. I was having an email discussion recently with Rich Frank, John Lundstrom, Barrett Tillman, my co-author Tony Tully. And actually, before I do this, I wanted to raise our collective water glasses to our buddy Rich Frank, who should have been chairing this panel, but had some urgent matter that he had to take care of. I'm going to do my best to channel my inner Rich Frank, and so as part of that, I would ask you to both treat me with a certain degree of sarcasm, because being sarcastic to John Parshall is something that Rich believes in deeply. And so anyway, I was having this email discussion with this group of luminaries, and John Lundstrom, of course, is one of the finest Pacific War historians that we have. He floated the notion that he believes the reason that Nimitz was appointed to command of the Pacific Fleet was because he was the safe choice and he didn't have a lot of allies. That this guy had run the Bureau of Personnel, in essence, and he was known as a manager, so we're going to put him out here in the Pacific, and he's just going to manage whatever assets that we've got. But if he doesn't do well, gee, that's not that big a loss if we end up having to relieve this guy. Where do you guys come down on that?
Well, I think he's mostly right. One of the things that's clear is Franklin Roosevelt liked Chester Nimitz. Clearly. He would call the house and he'd ask for Chester. One of the two photographs that Nimitz kept on his desk was to my old friend Chester Nimitz from your pal Frank Roosevelt. And I think that was semi-genuine. I mean, Roosevelt's a politician. He knows what he's doing here. But I think that's semi-true because Roosevelt loved the Navy. The old joke, you know, that George Marshall used to tell, I don't mind it you favor the Navy, but it bothers me when you refer to the Army as them and the Navy as us. But Roosevelt genuinely liked the Navy, and he genuinely liked Chester Nimitz. Now, the story is told, and I credit it, and I'll be interested to hear what Trent has to say about this, that Roosevelt wanted Nimitz to take that job a year before, 11 months before, and offered it to him, and Nimitz said, I'm too junior. It would irritate and annoy too many senior officers over me. Give it to somebody else, and that's how husband Kimmel got that job. And of course, you think about counterfactuals, which we were discussing last night, and counterfactual is if Nimitz accepts that job, he's in command on December 7th, 1941. Maybe he is shelved for the war to our great loss. But I think that there was some sense that Nimitz is the safe choice in that he would not do anything nutty. And Roosevelt knew that about him. Nimitz had served 2 terms as a chief of the Bureau of Navigation, which is essentially the Bureau of Personnel, we call it today. So he not only knew Roosevelt, he knew every officer in the Navy because their folders had come across his desk. So here's a guy who's knowledgeable, who's known, who's safe, who won't do anything crazy, and we'll see how it goes. So I think he's probably onto something there.
I disagree with an assumption that underpins John Lindstrom's argument, because I believe that he's placing it in the context of picking Nimitz after Pearl Harbor, after the Japanese attack. And he's thinking about, oh, Nimitz will be the safe choice because Germany first, this is our strategy, and we need someone who will not get out of hand in the Pacific. But I think we have to put ourselves back in the context of the immediate aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz is chosen not so much because there's a rational examination of all the potential officers who could command the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz is chosen because he was offered the job before. And so when Navy Secretary Frank Knox and President Roosevelt are casting about for who is going to replace Kimmel, because Kimmel is obviously, based on Knox's personal observation, not adequate to command the Pacific Fleet anymore, they need to pick someone. And they pick someone by looking at the list of people that they've already considered for that job. And Nimitz is at the top of that list. And so he's selected not so much because of the atmosphere that exists in December 1941. He's selected because of what they think about him a year before, in December of 1940. Now, if we look at U.S. strategy at that time, and one of the reasons Kimmel is picked, there is an assumption, yes, Germany first, Europe is the priority, but we need to be able to act aggressively against Japan. There's a threat that they will move south against the Philippines, against the Netherlands, East Indies. And one of the roles of the Pacific Fleet, the reason why Roosevelt has put it at Pearl Harbor, is to deter that Japanese aggression. In the event of war, the Pacific Fleet is supposed to sortie to the west, to attack the Japanese in the Marshalls, and to distract them from their southward advance. Kimmel has plans for this.
Right.
So Nimitz would have been expected to implement a similar policy, to develop similar plans. And while there are a number of officers who don't think he is very aggressive, we see that from what happens in early 1942, I think if you look at his career, and if you look at his record, and you look at the familiarity that Roosevelt has with him, Roosevelt not only sees, oh, he can manage well in terms of personnel, much like you've described, Craig, I think he also sees the seeds of someone who can execute U.S. policy in line with Roosevelt's desires. And that would have necessitated, in December 1940, a certain amount of aggressiveness. And I think Roosevelt has an inkling of that. And I think that's one of the reasons why Nimitz is on that short list and why he's picked in December 1941.
Interesting. Yeah, the whole topic of aggressiveness is one that continually recurs, particularly during the early part of the war, the first part of the year, really. And that gets into, you know, if we're going to talk about difficult people and difficult relationships, we have to start talking about Ernest King. Because King does not believe that Nimitz is that aggressive a guy. And so why did Roosevelt perhaps perceive that, but King misses it? What's going on there?
Well, King believes that, I think of all the people who thought Nimitz was the safe choice, King would be at the top of that list. The word he used to describe Nimitz was, he's a fixer. right? He can fix problems. He can solve problems. That's certainly true. And when we first began this conversation about the difficult personalities with whom he had to work, a fixer is somebody you want in that position. But King certainly, and probably almost everybody else, underestimated Nimitz's willingness to make a bold decision. Boy, do we see that over and over again in the Pacific War, particularly in the first 6 months of the Pacific War. Now, the tension here is that King is fighting on the combined chiefs of staff with those who say, well, hey, Germany first is our strategy, so the Pacific War gets nothing. And King was always fighting to get first 15% and then 25% and then 30% of Allied assets to commit to the Pacific, because his argument is, if we don't keep the Japanese back on their heels, they will consolidate these gains. It will cost us more in the long run to take them back. We can't just sit and let them do what they want to do in the Pacific. We have to go on the offensive a little bit. And so he was constantly pushing. You read the correspondence between them or the notes of the minutes when they met 16 times during the war, mostly in San Francisco, of their conversation. King is always saying, come on, Chester, let's go, let's do more. And Nimitz seems to be saying, well, yes, but. And so to King, it seems like he's dragging his feet. But in those moments when a tough decision has to be made, it's Nimitz who makes it often over King's concern. And that's particularly true of the Coral Sea and Midway. So Nimitz has hidden strengths and depths that I think even his champions underestimated.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I don't think you can fully understand or appreciate the war in the Pacific, the first 6 months of U.S. involvement, without understanding that relationship between Nimitz and King. King is extremely competent, and he knows it. You know, he's served in submarines, airplanes, surface ships. He thinks he can do anything in the Navy, and he thinks that he can probably do it better than just about anyone else. And so when he looks at Nimitz as a fixture, he's uncertain that he's going to be sufficiently aggressive, and he's looking for ways to mitigate that potential risk as King is trying to ensure that the lines of communication to Australia and New Zealand are preserved, not severed by the Japanese. And so one of the things that King is willing to do is to push Nimitz to the side and to assert his authority over what is called the Anzac area, which is formulated in early 1942. It's named that way because initially it was supposed to be an Australian and New Zealand area of responsibility, but King very quickly says or notices that they're ill-equipped to lead it, and so he takes on leadership of it himself through Vice Admiral Herbert Leary. And King is quite happy to draw on resources, Vice Admiral Wilson Brown's carrier task force, move it to the Anzac area and command it more or less himself from Washington. This doesn't work out terribly well. King ends up micromanaging things, but he's not convinced Nimitz can do the job. And that begins to shift as Nimitz displays aggressiveness in the Central Pacific with the other carrier task forces, executes the Doolittle raid quite well, and I think a seminal moment in their relationship is that first conference in San Francisco.
I was just going to ask about that.
April
That's in
1942. Because King shows up to that with a plan for eventually executing the South Pacific Offensive, what it ultimately turns into Operation Watchtower, captures Guadalcanal. Nimitz shows up with a plan to ambush a portion of the Kido Butai in the Coral Sea. It's the plan that leads to the Battle of Coral Sea. And my read on that is King is a little surprised. Oh, look what you can do. He doesn't approve it right away. But by the time Nimitz gets back to Pearl Harbor, the approval is waiting. And I think that is the beginning of King's understanding that Nimitz can execute an aggressive campaign in the Pacific and can be given a little bit of a leash. It waxes and wanes, the degree of leash he's willing to give to Admiral Nimitz.
Let me underscore that just a little bit if I can.
Yeah.
Excuse me, John. But one of the things that's seldom understood is that there were moments, particularly early in the war, and Trent mentioned it, and it reminded me of a case where King simply overrode Nimitz and began giving orders directly to the carrier task group in the Coral Sea, in the South Pacific, without telling Nimitz he's doing it. I mean, Nimitz is supposedly the theater commander. Orders are supposed to go down from King to Nimitz and then out to the fleet. King jumps right past that and starts giving orders. Well, here's what's interesting. Nimitz does not complain. He doesn't say, who do you think you are? This is my job. I mean, which is the instinctive thing to do. He simply notifies King that, okay, I've made arrangements to support and supply this fleet that you are now commanding. And he sends a note to Frank Jack Fletcher saying, please note that you are now reporting directly to Admiral King. No complaint, no whining. So his willingness, his ability to deal with that difficult personality is, I think, crucial to his temperament. Pardon me?
Doesn't that make him look weak, though? He truckles, and that's
it could. It could. But I don't think so in this case. I think the key to Nimitz's personality is his temperament, and he can dial that back. He can be as bold as possible, as we've mentioned, but he can also be patient and tolerant and wait things out, and that's what he did.
And what you see is a willingness to manage up.
Right.
He manages King in a way. I'm sure many of us in this room have had an overbearing boss who micromanages us. And
yeah, the reaction in the crowd here.
And there's different ways that you can deal with that, right? You could get frustrated and you could leave and you could walk out, or you could try to manage that relationship and find ways to demonstrate your capability. And a lot of times you have to do that indirectly, and that's one of the things that Nimitz does. He does it indirectly. There's a very important aspect that I think we should mention here. One of the things he does, he sends Vice Admiral Pye to Washington in February 1942. Now, Pye and King are buddies from way back. And so Pye going to Washington is a way for Nimitz to sort of manage that relationship. Send someone who has been in the Pacific, who's seen what it's like at SINCPAC headquarters, have them have a conversation with King, and have it not just be any old staff officer, have it be somebody that King knows and respects. Yeah. And I think that helps also. Yeah.
Do you think at that April meeting, though, that there was an element of a little bit of come to Jesus? Because both of you intimate that in your books, that we don't have a direct written record of what went down at that meeting.
We have the notes that have been recorded.
Right.
But they don't record everything.
Yeah, they're not going to say,
no.
This is where Chester said to Ernie, dude, you need to back off a little bit. I mean, but do we think that happened?
Go ahead.
I think if it didn't happen explicitly, then there was sufficient implicit discussion about it to begin to cover that topic. And I think Nimitz showing up with this plan of, look how aggressive I could be, look at this plan that I have, is what his vehicle for doing that.
And there are ways to do that. And back to the temperament question, you can say, well, you know, the logistical considerations, and there is an alternative, we could consider this. He never bumps heads confrontationally with his boss. He simply acts to deal with the circumstances and to suggest possibilities and alternatives. There was an interesting, after Nimitz died, his son Chet, who served in the Navy until he was a captain. There were some health problems. He, in my opinion, would have made admiral himself. But he wrote to his father when he was a junior officer and said, I have a terrible boss on board this ship. How do you deal with difficult bosses? And his father wrote him a very interesting letter, which I can paraphrase a little bit, but I can't quote from memory, but it's essentially, oh, just listen and nod and be polite and just get along until you're ready to rip that rug out from under him. Which I thought was an extremely illuminating comment. Anyway.
Yeah, so Chester would be a pretty formidable enemy.
He could be.
He could be. Interesting, interesting. Okay, so while we're on the topic of difficult personalities, Chester is in the mix. You've got guys like Holland, Smith, and these become more difficult the longer the war goes on. Can you talk a little bit about John Powers? And for the sake of the audience, John Powers was kicked out of Washington by King and sent out to the Pacific because King didn't want to deal with this guy anymore. He was a very senior naval aviator, and then he gets, what's his official position within the Pacific Fleet at that point? He's like the
organizational guy.
Deputy SINCPAC.
Yeah, he ends up being deputy SINCPAC.
He
becomes that.
But yeah, John Towers was a champion for naval aviation, and early in his career, he insisted that naval aviation should be a separate service, like the Marine Corps. He backed away from that, but he was absolutely committed to the idea that no black shoe, that is no ship driver, no surface warfare officer should ever command or be able to tell an aviator, a brown shoe, what to do. All carrier aviation groups, all carriers had to be commanded by men with wings on their chests, not these ship drivers. And of course, that had resonance in Washington. A lot of people thought that was absolutely a good idea. Nimitz couldn't stand him. And Nimitz tolerated everybody. He tolerated Ernie King, but John Towers was a real problem. Well, King didn't like Towers either. And King came up with a plan to put Towers in some sort of subsidiary position in Washington where he wouldn't have much influence. And he did it without telling Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt found out about it and wrote a blistering note to Ernie King, which is not characteristic of the president, saying, you know, I'm commander-in-chief, not you. So King had to come up with a way to move Towers out of Washington and to get him out of his way, and he dumped him essentially on Nimitz. So he comes out to Pearl Harbor as the #2, so he's essentially Nimitz's, not chief of staff, but deputy SINCPAC. And now Nimitz has to deal with him, and Nimitz does. And that, I think, is another insight of Nimitz's ability to deal with difficult. He writes an interesting letter to his wife when it says, I just found out that I'm going to have Towers in my headquarters building. And then the next sentence is really interesting. Never mind, we'll get along. And they mostly do.
Yeah, Nimitz is able to deal with Towers in some ways, I think, because of a bifurcation that he had created within the staff. And this goes back to early 1942, where he seeks out, you know, at the very beginning, who are the aggressive people on the staff that I can work with to formulate plans to get after the Japanese? And that turns out to be the war plans section of the prior SINCPAC staff, which is led by Charles Sock McMorris, nicknamed Socrates.
Sock, yeah.
And he's got a subordinate, Lynd McCormick, and between the two of them, they formulate the plans for the early raids, and then also Coral Sea and Midway. Now, Nimitz takes another aspect of his staff, initially led by the Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Milo Dremel, and Nimitz susses out Dremel pretty quickly. He's a good administrator. He can handle, you know, plans, orders, et cetera, but he's not aggressive. So I'm going to let Dremel handle, you know, convoy routing, logistics, and things like that. And so Nimitz has this bifurcation in the staff. There are the people who look after combat operations, and then there are the people who do the things that are necessary to ensure the combat operations can happen. And he parks Towers off on that non-combat operations side and lets him look after some of those things. And that way, there's no risk that Towers is going to get his hands on a fleet command or take over some sort of operational planning that is going to reflect the sort of brashness that Tower brings to the table and threaten the operations of the Pacific Fleet.
Let me tell one quick story about Towers, if I can. And this, I think, is illuminating as well. Towers, when he was Deputy SINCPAC in Pearl Harbor, found out that when submarine skippers would bring their boats in after a long patrol and they performed particularly well, that Charlie Lockwood or somebody else in the submarine staff would go down and award medals right there on the dock. Towers didn't like that. And so he started going out to the carriers when they returned and awarding medals on his own. And Nimitz did not like that. And Nimitz, ordinarily, Nimitz would, this was a standard routine. Management by walking around is the old business school model. He would go see people and stand by their desk. How's it going? What are you working on? Listen, I had an idea. But he sends a Marine orderly over to Towers' office and says, have Towers report to me immediately. Wow. So Towers comes in and he says, Towers, not Admiral Towers, Towers, I don't want you or anyone on your staff giving away medals without passing it through my office. Is that understood? That is so uncharacteristic that it showed me that there's some burr under the saddle for Nimitz in dealing with John Towers. He just didn't like him.
Yeah. David Conan, our mutual friend, made a comment during a panel that he was on at the McMullen Symposium, where all of us were. He said that there were 3 different occasions during the war that King was considering relieving Nimitz. And I don't know the particulars of that, but I wondered if you do.
You want to go?
I don't know the particulars of that.
I don't either.
It would not surprise me at all if there were a lot of conversations the king was having with people in his inner circle expressing frustration about Nimitz, because there are a number of times where he has to be pushing Nimitz in certain ways, as you described earlier, Craig. And I expect that that leads to a certain amount of tension and frustration. There's a very important dialectic between them, right? The king is always pushing, always trying to get Nimitz to be aggressive, and Nimitz is taking that and then being aggressive in his own ways at his own time and in moments of his own choosing, but also feeding information back up to King about personnel and who the best officers are to have in what positions, which is an area where King is somewhat weaker. So I expect there were moments where King was frustrated, like before the assault on the Marshall Islands, Operation Flintlock, Nimitz pushes that back as far as he can to the end of February. King had insisted that it occur, at the end of January 1944. King had insisted it be in January. So there may have been some tension there. I expect King was also very frustrated when they had that Pearl Harbor conference with General MacArthur's subordinates, and Nimitz seemed open to the idea of perhaps channeling the offensive through the Southwest Pacific. King was very frustrated by that, wrote a very sternly worded communication to Nimitz afterward. But what I understand is in some of these moments, particularly later in the war, once Secretary Knox has passed away and the Navy Secretary passes to Forrestal, Forrestal would have none of this. Like, yeah, okay, you can relieve Nimitz as sink pack, but then guess what? He becomes Commensch and you go out to grades. Evidently, he said something like that to
Well,
King.
fascinating. I never knew that. Okay. I wanted to ask just a little bit more about the development of Nimitz's staff through the war, because that really is one of the major subtexts of your book. You come at it from more of an organizational standpoint, because one of the things that's so interesting to me is that if you look at some officers, like Halsey, for instance, as the war goes on, it's clear that the war just gets too big for Halsey. He just can't really manage it effectively anymore. And yet we don't see that happening at Nimitz's level or with his staff. His staff seems to be constantly evolving as the conflict evolves. And I just wanted to give you some space to riff on that.
Oh, absolutely. This is one of the
And we only have 11 minutes to Q&A, just so you know. Keep that in mind.
This is one of the themes of my book, is looking at the evolution of Nimitz's staff, and it's evolving. It evolves over time, and probably the most significant or important change that happens is when it becomes a truly joint staff in September 1943. This is in preparation for the Central Pacific Offensive, and also based on feedback from the Army that they don't feel sufficiently well involved in the plans and in the operations. And this rises to the Joint Chiefs of Staff level. It's something that General Marshall takes to Admiral King, basically arguing, hey, look, we've got this pattern. MacArthur is employing it, Eisenhower is employing it. We establish a general headquarters, and then below the general headquarters, there are subsidiary commands for the various services, Army, Navy, Army Air Forces. Nimitz should do the same thing. Nimitz should have a general headquarters, he should be commanding the theater, and someone like Halsey should command the Pacific Fleet underneath him. This is the proposal that Marshall puts forward. And King and Nimitz disagree with this idea, primarily because they think the fleet, if properly handled, if it wins a victory over the Japanese, could become an arm of strategic decision. Basically, if we win the great fleet battle, which they're hoping is going to occur at Philippine Sea, then maybe we can advance more quickly. So Nimitz has to be both the theater commander and the fleet commander. But Nimitz acquiesces to the idea of having two staffs, essentially, a fleet staff and a joint staff. Eventually, the fleet staff fades away, and it just becomes a joint staff. But there's a willingness to adjust and adapt the configuration of that staff, who's part of the planning, who's responsible for the planning. Eventually, it becomes Forrest Sherman, who is really, really good. But prior to that, Nimitz has a number of other planning officers who serve with different levels of expertise and distinction. But that ability to adapt it and adjust it based on the needs of the war is really interesting. Halsey doesn't do as good a job. Mm-hmm. And this is an area where I think I don't want to call it a mistake necessarily, but where Nimitz and King could have done more, because you hear them, or in the records of some of their conferences, this is a topic, Halsey and his staff, and it's inadequacy. And if they had insisted on changes or reconfigurations prior to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Halsey might have been able to perform differently, and perhaps that unfolds very differently, and we don't get the Battle off Samara that we get, which lacks any Third Fleet ships or resources.
Right.
And we don't get the entirety of the Third Fleet sailing north to go after Admiral Ozawa, potentially.
Potentially, yeah. Yeah, that was one of the points that both of you made, that after the Battle of Philippine Sea, Nimitz is supportive of Spruance and backs his decision to defend the beaches, but I think inwardly he's disappointed that there was not a more decisive carrier battle there, and issues an instruction immediately thereafter that, you know, if we have an opportunity to destroy the enemy fleet, that becomes the main objective. And unfortunately, that sends, I think, just the wrong message to a guy like Halsey, and we end up with the Battle off Samar. And am I right in that?
No, I think that is right. Let me say a few things about staff here.
Yeah.
This is really Trent's area, but in terms of personality, Nimitz wanted a staff that he could have lunch with. When he first arrived in Pearl Harbor, he had a staff of in the teens, and they would go down to the submarine base, which is right by the headquarters there, and they would sit around at lunch, and they would talk. And then as the war became more and more complicated and became a joint staff and more people were added, and there were Marines, there were soldiers, there were airmen, and bigger and bigger and bigger, he just became frustrated by that. It was just awkward for him. There's a photograph of him with his staff in early 1944. There are 246 officers. Well, you can't have lunch with 246 officers. So in a way, what that tells us about Nimitz is he was a hands-on, face-to-face, let's have a meeting of the mind and understand each other kind of commander. And the more complicated and complex it got, the more frustrated he became by having to deal with that. But I think we need to mention here, too, you mentioned Dremel, whom he did not particularly care for. He thought Dremel was kind of a cipher and quietly moved him aside, didn't can him, but gave him something else to do. But then brought in the guy that he really wanted, and there's a genuine meeting of the mind, and the Venn diagram between the personalities of Nimitz and Spruance is almost an overlap. They are very similar types, and that 14 months that Nimitz spent with Spruance as his chief of staff, I think Nimitz particularly enjoyed that. But then he couldn't keep Nimitz at couldn't keep Spruance at headquarters. He needed him to command the fleet in the sea, and it was wrenching for him. And there's conversation while they're walking to work, and he said, I've decided I'm going to have to let you go command the fleet. And Spruance, of course, being Spruance, whatever you say, Admiral, you know, I'll do whatever you think is necessary. But that relationship is a key to understanding what's going on in the Pacific between Nimitz and Spruance. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I think there is, perhaps there is some anguish on Nimitz's part to see him go, but I think there is an understanding that, or they have developed a very shared sense of how to conduct the war in the Pacific. There's a tacit understanding between them. And so the choice to allow Spruance to command what is initially the Central Pacific Force and later the Fifth Fleet is deliberate, right? Because Nimitz now can trust Spruance. And if you look at the command structures that are established, it's very different from what happens in the Northern Pacific and the Southern Pacific, where there is sort of an area commander, Halsey in the south, Kincaid in the north, who commands from shore. Spruance doesn't want to be that. He doesn't want to be the Central Pacific commander. He wants to allow Nimitz to do that. And instead, Nimitz, or Spruance, commands the fleet and its amphibious operations. And so there's the intention there is to create a tight feedback loop between Nimitz's headquarters and Spruance's ability to execute plans and operations. And it works through the early phases of the Central Pacific Offensive, Galvanic, Flintlock, and then Forager, the campaign to take the Marianas. It works very well. It gets inside the Japanese decision cycle and keeps them off balance.
And you know that Spruance and Halsey each commanded what we'll call the Big Blue Fleet, Third Fleet when it was under Halsey, Fifth Fleet when it was under Spruance, but the same fleet. Very confusing to readers still, yes. And very confusing to the Japanese at the time. And those two very different personalities, there's another, back to a letter that Chet wrote, the son, after the war. He said that his father told him that when he wanted a cavalry charge, go in there and just knock heads, that was always Halsey's assignment. When he wanted a complex operation, such as a landing on Saipan, he wanted somebody with more subtle skills, and that was always Spruance's job. So they each had a particular personality characteristic to do the job that Nimitz tried to assign to them.
So during the course of your research, and this is interesting to me too, just as an author, you know, you always run across surprising tidbits that you didn't necessarily anticipate were out there. And you actually gave me one in the course of your book, in that you found Chester Nimitz's recipe for his favorite cocktail, the Sink Pack, and you provided that to me. And
Why did I know you were going to ask me about this, John?
No, I actually do genuinely want to know, what was the most surprising moment in your research?
Oh, I see. I thought you would want me to do the recipe for the drink.
If this had not been a morning session, we would have had Sink Packs here with us. But anyway.
The most surprising thing, I suppose, are those few moments in Nimitz's career when he does bristle. I told you the one about John Towers. He bristled at John Towers. I think he was annoyed, although he kept it inside, on the whole Smith versus Smith controversy, right, when General Robertson came back to Pearl Harbor and said, I want this guy cashiered. And the third one is that when he had to deal with Sutherland, who is Douglas MacArthur's chief of staff, who came to Nimitz's headquarters with words from the deity saying, here's how you will behave and what you will do. And Nimitz just looked at him and said, no, I will not. And then ticked him off. I will not surrender the forces under my command to General MacArthur. I will not do it. And Sutherland, you can understand, nobody's ever talked about MacArthur like that to Sutherland. So I think what surprised me were those moments when that cool temperament, that fixer mentality, I can't take any more. And it just bubbled right up, and you see it. And I think on those three occasions it was evident.
Interesting. Trent, how about you?
There is a bit of a veneer that Nimitz was able to create over his command and his career. Certain letters survive. You've noted a few of them, but some of the letters from very important or critical times don't.
Yeah.
And so what has been allowed to survive oftentimes reinforces that veneer, that face that Nimitz wanted to present to us and to history. And one of the things that I was really grateful to find is an interview conducted in the 1960s with Ernest Eller. It's in the Naval War College archives. And Nimitz shares certain things during that interview that I tried to weave into the book, one of which is he confesses that his first choice for an initial carrier raid in early 1942 into the Marshall Islands turned him down. He doesn't say who it was.
Right.
But if you look at what carrier group was in Pearl Harbor at the time, and if you look at the initial plans that were formulated for that operation, it must have been Vice Admiral Wilson Brown.
Wilson Brown. Yeah.
And now Brown's allowed to continue, right? He says, no, it's too risky to go into the Marshalls. But Nimitz doesn't push him to the side, doesn't cashier him, none of those things. Allows him to continue to serve with distinction and demonstrates his value, which I think is something that Nimitz brought to the table.
And subsequently, Brown withdrew from the attack to Rabaul, which is, oh, I won't have enough fuel, I don't have enough food to feed my men, and back he comes, so.
But what I really liked about that, which I didn't find a way to weave into the book, but is nice, is when that conversation, when that interview turned to the top of Admiral Halsey, and it's recorded in the notes of the interview, Nimitz's face brightens up. So Halsey is someone that could do the cavalry charges, but I think he's also, 20 years on, looking back at Halsey and thinking about, yes, there's typhoons, doesn't handle Lady Gulf quite well, but Halsey, someone, particularly in those early days, in those carrier raids and then again at Guadalcanal, could save Nimitz's and the Pacific Fleet's bacon. And so he looks back fondly on that subordinate.
I think that's true.
Interesting.
I think that's true.
We have reached the point of bringing our audience in for a little Q&A, and I would just like to start out by saying one of the joys of speaking here at the museum is that, of course, we have the most knowledgeable audience in the world. I would ask you to please phrase your questions as questions rather than statements so that we can get as many of them in as possible. Thank you so much. And this is where I put on my hat. so that I can see through the glare of the lights here. Jeremy, do your thing.
And that's pretty good branding. We should do that for all of our panelists. Get a tight shot on John. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Parshall, Craig Symonds, Trent Hone, great conversation.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, we're going to start to your left towards the back, please.
Why do you think that Admiral Spruance is not as well known or revered among the average American? And if Halsey received a 5th star, should not Spruance have received a 5th star? Thank you.
Do it.
Yes, he should have.
Yes.
Next question.
I think the reasons for it are exactly the reasons that Trent articulated, that early in the war, Halsey made newspaper headlines in the United States that allowed the American public, and for that matter, the administration, to put as good a face as possible on the way the war was going in the Pacific. And I think the individual most responsible for the 4-star, 5-star, for those who don't know, Congress passed a law saying you can only have 4 individuals in each service, the Army and the Navy, who would be advanced to a 5-star rank. And of course, the first 3 of those are self-evident. It's going to be Leahy, who was the President's Chief of Staff. It's going to be King, who was Commensch, and it's going to be Nimitz. And there's one more. Well, is it going to be Halsey or is it going to be Spruance? A year goes by before that decision is made, and the decision, I think, really comes down to Carl Vinson, who was the powerful chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, House Naval Affairs Committee. And he decided, based on what I've been able to discover, that it was that reason, the one Trent mentioned, that without Halsey in that first 6 to 8 months, we'd have been in real trouble. And yes, Halsey makes mistakes, but they were mistakes of commitment, mistakes of aggressive personality. And that's why the decision was made. Now, I've had petitions from people all over the country ever since that Congress should, ex post facto, give Spruance a 5th star. I wouldn't be against that. I'm a big fan of Spruance, but I think that's the reason why. Trent?
I would agree. I think it's, if you look at their record and the role that they played during the war and the quality of the leadership that they provide, Spruance is even with Halsey in that regard. And I think it's unfortunate that the way that the 5 stars were allocated or conceived just didn't leave room for him.
Gentlemen, next question is going to be to your left towards the very back.
So it is said that in 1941, General Marshall engaged in a thorough purge of who he thought were incompetent officers in the Army. Did King or Secretary Knox or Nimitz do an equivalent siphoning off of the people they didn't think were capable of doing the work?
I don't think that there's a purge in that sense. There is certainly, we talked about Milo Dremel, and Nimitz, pushes him to the side. There's definitely a weeding out of people who are felt to be insufficiently capable for the task at hand. And ultimately, Pai is one of those as well. He assumes command of the battleships, but not long after Midway is routed to be head of the Naval War College. So a number of these officers are channeled into roles that are more suitable for what Nimitz, King, and Admiral Jacobs, the head of the Bureau of Navigation, later Bureau of Personnel, feel are more suitable. One of the things that I think is very revealing about these conferences that you mentioned between Nimitz and King is they always have a personnel component, usually with the head of the Bureau of Personnel as well. But it's the 3 of them in the room talking about senior officers, talking about how best to bring up those who are displaying talent and displaying the necessary aggressiveness to wage the war effectively. How can they be given roles of responsibility, and how can others who are either tired or not up to it be routed appropriately to roles that are more suitable for them? And this is an area where Nimitz is showing his value not just as commanding the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Ocean areas, but also as a knowledgeable personnel specialist who can inform that process. But it doesn't take the form of a purge. It's much more of a deliberate, conscious weeding out of people who aren't seen as quite.
And it wasn't always unanimous either among the three. I mean, one of the controversial ones is Frank Jack Fletcher, whom King never really trusted and found an opportunity to get rid of by sending him on shore duty after the Saratoga was torpedoed and was being repaired. And he never goes back to sea, becomes commander of a naval district, which is, you know, essentially being shelved. Nimitz was a defender of Fletcher, had to write letters to King saying he's a hard-charging, competent, aggressive naval officer, and he's the guy I want. And King said, okay, fine, you can keep him for another couple of months. And thank goodness, because Coral Sea perhaps would have gone differently, for that matter, Midway as well, had he not been there. And this is for John Lundstrom, who I think saved Frank Jack Fletcher's reputation with this wonderful book on Fletcher. So.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to add to that, too, is that one of the things that Nimitz is famous for is giving people second chances.
Yeah.
So you look at the career of Mark Mitcher, who clearly had gun-decked his report for Midway, and it was equally clear that Spruance knew about it, and therefore Nimitz knew about it immediately thereafter. You know, Mitcher gets sidelined, and he does explicitly say, I've been shelved.
I've been shelved.
I've been shelved, and I'm commanding I've been promoted to admiral, and now I'm commanding a pat wing up in Kaneohe, running flying boats. And so he was, put in the doghouse for 1.5 years, but eventually Nimitz decides to, maybe a year.
Brings him back.
Yeah, because he goes down to become Air Sols, command the aircraft in the Solomons.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's his command that is
It takes a
responsible
while,
for
though.
eliminating Yamamoto.
It takes a while to get back to command of aircraft carriers. That's the point I'm trying to make, but in any case.
Second chances is the main point there.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right.
Next question is towards the front to your left.
I'm just wondering, I know Nimitz is not the highest ranking officer, but can you draw parallels between him and Eisenhower? Did he have to try and coordinate with all the other countries, or all, like the generals of the Army and the Air Force and the Navy?
That is such a good question.
It is a good question.
And thank you for that. Absolutely is the answer. And I think, who's who in this game? I mean, first of all, Montgomery is Douglas MacArthur, right? That's one.
That's beautiful.
Am I wrong?
No, you're not.
Patton is Halsey. I mean, there are difficult personalities in each theater, and Nimitz's skill, like Eisenhower's skill, is getting all of these people to work together effectively. Eisenhower never commanded troops in combat. It bothered him his whole life. He was a tank trainer in World War I, so he missed that, and he was already too senior. He was the plans officer and a one-star when World War II begins, so he never really is out in the field directing combat operations, but boy, was he the right guy to deal with Allied politics and military politics within the U.S. Army between Bradley and Patton and among many other things. So yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities, and if you want to be cute about this, Eisenhower Nimitz, the Germans won World War II. No?
The one caveat or qualification I would add to that is Eisenhower has to manage, I'm using that word very deliberately, a coalition, an international coalition. Right. And although there is an international element to the war in the Pacific that Nimitz wages, eventually the British Pacific Fleet comes in and participates, and there are New Zealand forces in the South Pacific, but for the large part, Nimitz only has to worry about the United States and the forces of the United States. And King has shaped that deliberately to try to remove the potential friction and misunderstanding that might exist from a coalition, from a combined force in the Pacific Ocean areas. And so yes, there are difficult and strong personalities, but the international element doesn't weigh as heavily on Nimitz's command.
Correct.
Right. Next question.
Next question to the front to your left, please.
So this is for Craig. First of all, probably the best book I've read in the last 10 years. In fact, I read it.
What a great question.
We allow segues into statements when it's, accolades for our books. Absolutely.
In fact, I read it twice, which says more about my own education. But
one of the things that struck me was how much of a tour guide Nimitz was in Hawaii and so forth. And can you just talk about how he managed his time and his energy and so forth? Because that's what I really learned a lot about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's true. And this kind of builds on what Trent was just saying about that Nimitz did not have an international coalition as much in the Pacific, but he did have to deal with people who wanted to come out and get their photograph taken in Hawaii. Congressmen, politicians, newspaper reporters. And I suspect very strongly one of the reasons Nimitz moved his headquarters from Pearl Harbor to Guam in January 1945 is to get as far away from Washington as he could to discourage people from coming to his headquarters. Not that it worked. But he did spend, I think, a disproportionate amount of time, certainly from his point of view, having to smile and be nice and show around, visiting congressional teams. One of my favorite stories about that is when the Naval Affairs Committee en masse descended on his headquarters. There wasn't enough room for everybody to sleep, and one junior member from Texas had to sleep on a cot, folding cot in his headquarters, and that was LBJ. So, but yeah, it is true that I think it's frustrating for anyone who arises to the position of high command responsibility that you have to spend time taking care of politicians and reporters and others who come, and Nimitz tried to limit it. He issued rules saying no one without business in the theater is allowed to come to the, never mind, they came anyway. But especially when Forrestal became SecNav, he just overruled him. He said, oh no, Henry Luce is coming, make way. But you're right, it was frustrating for him to have to do that, but he did it. And he did it with a smile, or at least that kind of a smile, the one you see on the screen. One quick story. One of the things I often say is you always see him with this grim, closed-mouthed smile, not because he's grim, but because he was ashamed of his teeth. He had terrible, terrible teeth. Most of them were missing. His twin grandsons sent me his medical records, and he was not physically qualified by virtue of having insufficient number of teeth in his mouth to hold the job that he did. So he never was photographed. And I told this once at a conference not too long ago, and a few days later somebody sent me a photograph they had of Nimitz smiling. And it's terrifying. So I know why he kept his mouth closed, but anyway, that's it.
Trent, any follow-ups on that?
The only thing that I would add to that is less about entertaining people, but how dedicated Nimitz was to ensuring that he got sufficient exercise, playing tennis, swimming. Yeah. Evidently, his walks were extremely long and strenuous. Members of the staff tried to avoid it. And also very interested in the pistol range. And this is an area where we could see some anxiety. And if I recall, it's the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, the galvanic operation. Tarawa does not go well, as we all know. And there's a quote about Nimitz shooting off thousands of rounds in the pistol range while he's waiting to hear, what's happening in the Gilberts.
Yeah, the other one is horseshoes, of course.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
He was an inveterate horseshoe player, and in the middle of Leyte Gulf, he's standing there watching the board with not moving pieces, but people shoving little boats around on the map. And he gets up and walks out and starts throwing horseshoes. So clearly, these are what you feel that pressure building up inside, and either throwing horseshoes or going to the pistol range were ways that he would blow off steam. Yeah.
I was intrigued by the vignette from your book, too. And speaking of VIP visits, the very VIPest is when FDR comes out to visit, and Nimitz discovers at the last moment that the president is expecting to have lunch at my headquarters.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And so while they're taking the president around the island, meanwhile, back at his house, the Seabees are literally digging up palm trees, creating a new road with a ramp to the back door, and raising the toilet by 5 inches so that the president can go to the bathroom. I mean, that's the kind of stuff you got to do. You got to be able to pivot.
Can do.
That's right.
That's the CB motto.
Next question, please.
To your left in the front, please.
I wonder if you would elaborate on his island hopping strategy.
I'm happy to take that.
There are,
so many people want to take credit for the origination of it. And I think there is enough of a blur in the historical record that it's difficult to assign it to anyone. But this is an area where I think King does show his acumen and his insistence. There was a lot of exchanges after the campaign in Guadalcanal has been successful, so in the South Pacific, where to go next. King wants it to move forward very quickly, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff have agreed that now direction of that effort is going to shift to MacArthur. MacArthur isn't quite ready. He wants to move first, of course, so he sort of insists that Halsey hold back a little bit. But there is concern, and this is the Japanese strategy aligns with this, that the offensive will be slow because it'll advance more linearly, island to island. So King wants the offensive to move more quickly. This prompts Nimitz, prompts Halsey. They think about how to bypass Japanese positions, and you see it beginning there in the South Pacific. It also happens in the North Pacific. There aren't sufficient amphibious assault resources to move against Kiska directly, and Nimitz and others are trying to figure out what to do with this. And Admiral Kincaid actually is the source of an idea, because he is going to be responsible in the North Pacific. Hey, we don't have enough to assault Kiska, but we could go to Attu. We could bypass
further
Kiska,
out on the Aleutians chain.
And that's approved, and then they do that. And then it gains momentum as they think about the Central Pacific offensive. There's no real skipping that happens with Galvanic moving into the Gilberts, but a big skip happens when they go to the Marshalls. They bypass the Eastern Marshalls, which have been fortified, much like Tarawa was, and go directly to Kwajalein. And this is where I see a lot of this beginning. But there's still a question about what's going to happen next. Truk, major Japanese fleet base. This has been targeted potentially for an assault. King insists that this not happen, right? It'll bog things down, it'll take too long. So eventually, Nimitz is convinced we can bypass Truk. It is subjected to a very substantial carrier raid, but then they advance to the Marianas. So
I was just going to add, yeah, thank you for putting up, we've just been blazing through. Everybody good with your Pacific geography here? You know where all these places are, right? Just for the sake of our listeners, let's see, I'm trying to find Truk down here. Yeah, right there, there's Truk.
Yeah, so what emerges, and it is a coincidence of different factors. The strategy, there's a recognition that the Pacific War needs to be brought to a conclusion relatively quickly. The logistical capabilities of Nimitz's command are improving, so it's possible to conduct offensives at greater distance and with greater reach and sustain them. And the fleet grows in size and capability, and so it can protect these large amphibious movements. At the same time, there's land-based air power that can cover some of these things. The liberators, both the Army version and the Navy version, are put into service to not only conduct reconnaissance, but to bomb some of these islands in anticipation of a carrier raid and then an amphibious assault. And all this comes together to allow the offensive to move more quickly, to make island hopping a standard and less of a risk. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Anything you want to add?
Well, I just to back up a little bit, the whole concept of island hopping didn't emerge during or just before World War II. The earliest versions of Plan Orange, the operational war plan against Japan, were dated from 1911. And there were two options. One was what they called the through ticket to Manila, that the fleet would mobilize in Hawaii and just drive all the way across the Pacific, and somewhere before they got to the Philippines, the Japanese would come out, there'd be a big battle, we'd win, and that would be the end of the war. But then it was recognized that logistically that was almost impossible. So that the idea of stopping at various points in Kwajalein, Saipan, elsewhere, was going to be necessary. So the idea of island hopping, it really has deep roots. The invention, the innovation rather, was the idea of bypassing critical spots. And he's right, bypassing Kiska to go to Attu, bypassing Truk to get all the way to Saipan. Probably the most famous one in the South Pacific is bypassing Rabaul. For more than a year, Rabaul had been the target for the South Pacific campaign. But in the end, they decided they'd bombed it and bypassed it and cut it off. And when the war ended, there were 100,000 Japanese soldiers in Rabaul still waiting for the American invasion. So it's less island hopping than island bypassing that's the great innovation of the Second World War in the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
Gentlemen, next question, center aisle with Connie to your right.
This is really not a question, but I'm from Texas, and there is a beautiful little town, which is actually a big town now, called Fredericksburg in the hill country of Texas. And there's the Nimitz Hotel in Fredericksburg, where Nimitz apparently grew up. It's now the Nimitz Museum, and it's next door to the Museum of the Pacific War, which is pretty cool. Just the town itself has grown so big, it's not quite as quaint as it used to be, but boy, it was nice back in the day.
Can I add to that? If I may, I was a director of the museum thanks to my friend Mike Hagee, who's the CEO out there, former commandant of the Marine Corps, who also grew up in Fredericksburg, Texas, went to Fredericksburg High School. But it is the birthplace of Chester Nimitz. It is in the hill country. Apparently there were no dentists there back in the early day. I think they fixed that. Yeah. But this audience in particular, I think, would enjoy a visit there. It's a nice, officially the National Museum of the Pacific War. And if you're going to have a National Museum of the Pacific War, where else would you put it but in the hill country of Texas? But it is a nice museum, and I can recommend it.
Yep. Absolutely.
Gentlemen, next question's all the way to your right in the front, please.
Nimitz had the biggest Navy show of the war, and there were a couple of guys in the White House, a former Navy Assistant Secretary and his Chief of Staff in Roosevelt and Leahy, who had a lot of interest in the Navy. What was the level of interaction between the White House and Nimitz and their staffs?
There's a stumper.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, of course, you know, Nimitz was in Hawaii and then Guam, and Roosevelt was in the White House. John mentioned that they met famously in Hawaii for that strategy conference where the three of them talked together. That was largely, but not exclusively, a photo op. Roosevelt was running for his fourth term as president, and being photographed with his two Pacific commanders was probably good PR. But by and large, the conversations about strategy and planning, and certainly operational decision-making, did not go to Franklin Roosevelt. They would meet as a group, they would make a decision, and they would go to the White House, famously in late 1944, to have lunch with the president and say, here's what we decided. And Roosevelt will say, that's great, good luck.
And if I can chime in on that one too, Leahy is incredibly important and also flies very much under the radar. Leahy is Roosevelt's twin when it comes to strategy making. And so FDR understands implicitly that by having Leahy as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that he is going to get his strategic vision channeled correctly to the remainder of that body. And so I think, I don't see a tremendous amount of hands-on activity in terms of FDR, because I think that he knows that Leahy is going to handle any of those aspects that need to be handled.
I think the only area that might need some qualification with regard to that is early 1942, because then the disaster that is unfolding in the Pacific is something that Roosevelt is paying close attention to and concerned with. And fortunately, enough trust develops in Nimitz and King. Leahy joins the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that Roosevelt feels comfortable stepping back. But I think we see certain activities, and we haven't mentioned this one yet, in early 1942, there's that selection board, the unofficial board to identify
the
40 most qualified officers in the Navy. And it's a bunch of retired fleet commanders on there, as well as King and Chief of Naval Operations at the time, Admiral Harold Stark. And Nimitz doesn't make this list of top 40.
And he knows it. He becomes aware of it.
That's when he writes a letter to his wife, says, I may not last in this job for 6 months. And I think he expects to be relieved at the end of 6 months. But then, Coral Sea, Midway. And never mind.
Yeah, actually, we're doing good. Next question.
We're going to go to your right, gentlemen, with Connie. halfway back.
At the end of the 1976 movie Midway, the Henry Fonda, who played Nimitz in that film, asked the question and said, well, were we better than the Japanese or just luckier? Could you comment on that, please?
Wow.
That's huge.
Yeah, right. That is a fascinating question. And I think you have to analyze it at a number of different levels. Were we luckier or were we better? I think that if you look at the tactical level, the Japanese were certainly as good as we were. If you look at the quality of the aviators and their dive bomber and torpedo bomber squadrons, that they were, equal in caliber to what we had on our flight decks. It's at the higher levels of management that you see a marked superiority, certainly in terms of battle planning. Nimitz really, puts his mark on the Battle of Midway and sets it up to be successful. And then if you go down at the task force level, it's clear that the orders that Nimitz gives to both Spruance and Fletcher are brilliant and allow them to fight that battle congruently with Nimitz's overall vision for that battle. So I think that just going into the battle, it's clear that we have some advantages there in terms of our preparation and our leadership, and obviously, the code breaking figures into all of that. But there is a tremendous luck factor that comes into that as well. The fact that the climactic dive bomber attack occurs because we have 3 separate squadrons of dive bombers moving in 2 separate directions against a Japanese fleet that doesn't have radar and has pretty flimsy cap arrangements. Now that's a stroke of luck that no one could have predicted, and it leads to an outsized result. So I guess my answer is both. That we were better at certain levels, and we also got very lucky in the mix as well. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think the luck shows up from a tactical level. But one of the things that an analogy that may help understand the run-up to Midway is I think you can see the first several months of the war in the Pacific. It's akin to two boxers. In the first couple rounds, the American boxer is feeling out the opponent. You can see a buildup, a sense of increasing confidence in the kind of information that Nimitz and his staff can gather from intelligence as early as February 1942 and then leading up. It informs the plans for Coral Sea. And one of the things that Nimitz realizes is he can force the Japanese to react. And so the run-up to Midway is looking for ways to force the Japanese to react, to create the potential for an opportunity to ambush a major portion of the Japanese fleet. And Nimitz correctly perceives that opportunity is arising at Midway. So there is a very deliberate intention of creating an ambush there. He understands that there is chance, there is luck, war is contingent, but he's stacking the deck in the favor of his forces and creating the conditions that could allow victory to arise. It is a lot nearer run, I think, in the end, than Nimitz expected it to be.
Yeah.
The submarines do virtually nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah, very disappointing.
The planes from Midway do very little. They keep the Japanese carriers reacting. But I think he expected more of an impact on the tactics or on the outcome of the battle from the other forces that he positioned in and around Midway.
One final point I'd like to make there. I think that when the first books came out on the code-breaking aspect of these battles, and that started happening in the 1980s, that the interpretational pendulum in World War II history leaned very much towards this notion that if I can read the other guy's mail, I'm going to win that battle. And it seems to make sense, right? But if you look at the battles of 1942, and I make this point in my forthcoming book too, if you look at what's going on in the Middle East at this point, the British have got wonderful information coming to them on Rommel's intentions via Ultra, and yet they cannot translate that into meaningful results on the battlefield. If you just don't have a good enough tactical organization to get the job done, it doesn't matter if you're reading the other guy's mail or not. So this notion that just because we have broken Japan's codes at Midway, ipso facto means we're going to win that battle is absolutely untrue. You still have to have aviators that are good enough that they can put the bomb on the target. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Parshall, Craig Symonds, and Trent Hone.
Gentlemen. Yeah, a lot of fun.
I went fast.
Thank you.
You did.